The ring wasn't just gold. It was the last echo of a promise made under a summer sky. But promises couldn't fill an empty belly, couldn't quell a mother's fever. So the widow Elara slid that memory across the worn wood of the mercantile counter, a final, silent trade. A heart for a single day's hope. She didn't see the stranger in the corner, a man as weathered as the plains themselves, watching the quiet sacrifice. He saw a soul about to break, and knew he was the only one who could stop it. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you love Wild West stories. The silence was the first thing you noticed, the first thing that greeted you when you crossed the threshold, and the last thing that followed you out. It was a physical weight in the small, dust-caked farmhouse, a heavy blanket woven from stillness and sorrow that smothered the very air in Elara's lungs. It clung to the rough-hewn timbers of the walls and settled in the deep cracks of the floorboards, a constant, oppressive companion in a world that had become too quiet. The only sound that dared to challenge it was the one Elara had come to both dread and pray for, a shallow, rattling breath from the other room, a dry whisper of life clinging stubbornly to her mother, Martha. Each fragile inhale was a victory, each ragged exhale a reminder of how little time was left. Hope was a currency she could no longer afford. She traced the rim of a cracked ceramic cup on the kitchen table, her eyes scanning the room for something, anything, that wasn't already gone. The larder door hung slightly ajar, revealing a stark, unforgiving emptiness that mirrored the hollow ache in her own chest. The last of the flour had been a pale ghost on her fingertips 3 days ago, the final handful of beans a sad rattle in the bottom of a tin before that. She ran a hand over the rough burlap of the rice sack, feeling for the familiar weight and finding only limp, defeated fabric. The water barrel by the door was just as cruel. She didn't need to lift the lid to know the hollow echo it would return, the sound of utter depletion. This was the landscape of her desperation, a map of everything she had lost. The world had shrunk to these 4 walls, to the space between one of her mother's weakening heartbeats and the next. It was a world of shadows, a place where the setting sun didn't promise rest, but another long, cold night of listening to that fading breath in the dark. A profound, soul-crushing dilemma had taken root in the silence, a terrible question that demanded an answer. How much was a memory worth? What was the price of a ghost when weighed against the chance for one more sunrise? Her gaze drifted from the emptiness of the room to the back of her own hand, where a sliver of afternoon light caught the faint, warm glint of worn gold. She sat by the window, turning her hand over in the pale, weary light of the afternoon, watching the way the gloom of the room seemed to bend around the thin circle of gold on her finger. It was not an object, not anymore. It was a character in her story, a silent witness, the last citizen of a country that no longer existed. The ring remembered. It remembered the impossible heat of a sun-drenched July afternoon, the kind of day where the sky was a deep, aching blue and the air hummed with the lazy drone of bees. It remembered the rough, calloused warmth of his hands as they held hers, his touch so gentle, so certain. It held the echo of his voice, not the words themselves, but the low, steady timbre of his promise, a sound that had felt more solid than the earth beneath their feet. The metal on her skin was not metal, it was the last tangible piece of that sunlight, a ghost of gold that had outlived the man who gave it. He had placed it on her finger under the shade of a rustling cottonwood, the light dappling through the leaves, and in that moment, the future had felt like a long, open road, a story they would write together. But the pages had run out too soon. A sudden gust of wind rattled the window pane, the sound like a handful of dirt thrown against glass, and the sun-drenched memory fractured, dissolving back into the cold, gray present. The chill of the room seeped back into her bones. From the other room came that sound again. The whisper-thin breath of her mother, a sound that anchored her to the here and now with a brutal, unforgiving weight. The ring was a promise to the past, but her mother's life was a demand from the present. And she knew, with a certainty that settled deep and heavy in her soul, that the love that had placed the ring on her finger was the very same love that now demanded she let it go. It was a cruel, perfect circle. The warmth of that memory, the strength of that promise, was not a reason to keep it safe. It was the price. It was the only thing of true value she had left to spend. Slowly, deliberately, Elara curled her fingers inward, her knuckles white, closing her hand into a tight fist. The ghost of gold disappeared into the darkness she had made, its light extinguished, its warmth now nothing but fuel for the long walk ahead. The sound of the door closing behind her was a flat, final crack that severed the world in two. Behind it lay the quiet, private realm of her grief, the sacred space of her mother's shallow breathing and the ghosts of a happier life. Ahead lay the world, a vast, sun-scorched stage for the desperate act she was about to perform. Her first steps were heavy, each footfall a conscious effort to push against an invisible current of memory trying to drag her back inside. The fist in her pocket, where the ring was now a hard, unforgiving knot against her knuckles, was the only anchor she had to the present. The land offered no comfort. It was a harsh, unforgiving mirror of the desolation in her soul. The wind, a hot and tireless thing, rose to meet her not as a breeze but as an adversary, whipping strands of hair across her face and pressing against her thin dress with an insistent, prying force, as if trying to strip away the very resolve she had so carefully assembled. The sun was a merciless, white eye in a bleached blue sky, baking the hope from the cracked earth until it split into 1,000 tiny fissures, a web of fractures just like the one spreading across her own heart. Dust, fine as flour, rose with every step, coating her worn boots, her hem, the back of her throat, a constant, gritty taste of the poverty that was slowly grinding her down. The path to town was not a path at all, but a faint suggestion of passage choked with sharp stones that twisted at her ankles and stubborn, thorny weeds that clawed at her skin. Each step was a betrayal of the past, a small death to the woman she had been. The rhythm of her walking was the only clock now, a steady, painful beat against the anvil of the silent plains. 1 step. 2 steps. The promises she had made to him fought against the promise she was trying to keep for her mother. The gold in her hand grew heavier, hotter, a burning coal of memory. Then, something shifted. As the distant, hazy shapes of the town began to resolve on the horizon, a new rhythm took hold. The pace of her heart quickened, and her feet followed. The heavy, grief-stricken shuffle transformed into a clipped, determined stride. The time for sorrow was a luxury she had spent on the trail, what remained was the cold, hard currency of purpose. For Martha. 1 more step. For Martha. The wind was no longer an adversary but a force to lean into. The sun was no longer a judge but a simple, brutal fact of the day. She was no longer a widow lost in her grief, she was a daughter on a mission, a warrior marching toward her own surrender. She did not slow as she reached the edge of town, the first dusty street that marked the end of her solitude. She paused only for a single, sharp intake of air, steeling herself before stepping from the harsh, honest wilderness into the far more dangerous territory of other people's eyes. The jingle of the bell above the door was a sharp, tinny sound that felt entirely too loud, a public announcement of her private shame. Alara stepped from the blinding, honest glare of the sun into the cool, cluttered dimness of the mercantile, a world that smelled of kerosene, old wood, and the faint, sweet scent of decay. It took a moment for her eyes to adjust, to make sense of the chaotic landscape of shadows and shapes, sacks of flour and beans slumped against walls like sleeping men, barrels of nails and pickles standing guard, bolts of calico and denim stacked in silent judgment. Behind the long, scarred wooden counter stood the shopkeeper, Mr. Henderson, a man who seemed to have been carved from the same worn, hardened material as his surroundings. He was not a villain, not a man who took pleasure in the misfortune of others. He was simply a creature of the frontier, a pragmatist whose heart had been calloused over by years of weighing desperation against coin. He looked up from his ledger, his eyes not unkind, but utterly devoid of sentiment. They were the eyes of a man who saw the world for what it was, a series of transactions. Alara's throat was a knot of dust and fear. She moved toward the counter as if wading through thick water, her hand still a tight fist in her pocket. In the far corner of the store, half hidden by the long shadow of a towering shelf, a man sat quietly on a crate. A cowboy, from the look of his worn hat and dusty boots. He was a spectral presence, so still he seemed to be just another fixture of the room, yet his silence was different from the silence of the store. She couldn't bear to be witnessed. With a trembling hand, she reached into her pocket, her fingers uncurling from the ring. She placed it on the counter. The sound it made was impossibly small, a tiny click of gold on wood that was swallowed by the immense, waiting quiet. Henderson picked it up with a pair of brass tweezers, his movements precise and impersonal. He held a loop to his eye, turning the simple band over and over, his face impassive. The silence stretched, thin and brittle. "It's old. Not much weight to it." The words were flat, a simple statement of fact that landed like a blow. Alara's own voice was a reedy whisper she barely recognized. "It's for my mother. She's sick. I just need enough for food and medicine." Henderson's gaze flickered to her face for a moment, and for an instant, she thought she saw a flicker of something human, a phantom of pity. But it was gone as quickly as it came, replaced by the detached calculus of his trade. 40's my offer. Take it or leave it. 40. The number was an insult to the memory, to the sun-drenched day under the cottonwood, to the entire life it represented. A tear she had sworn she would not shed burned in the corner of her eye. She looked from the ring to the shopkeeper's impassive face, her hope shriveling into a black cinder. This was it. The end of the line. She gave a slow, defeated nod. The slow, defeated nod was a final surrender, a breaking of the last thread of her resistance. Alara's spirit seemed to collapse inward, leaving nothing but a hollow shell ready to endure the finality of the transaction. But before the word yes could form on her lips, a new sound cut through the heavy silence of the mercantile. It was not a loud sound, just the deliberate scrape of a worn boot heel on a dusty floorboard, followed by the low groan of old wood taking a man's weight. The cowboy from the corner was moving. He rose from the shadows not with a swagger, but with a quiet, powerful grace, his large frame unfolding from the gloom like a slow, inevitable force of nature. He approached the counter, his spurs silent, his gaze fixed not on Alara, but on the shopkeeper. Henderson's calculating eyes narrowed slightly, sensing a shift in the currents of the room. The cowboy said nothing. He simply reached into a worn leather pouch at his belt and placed a handful of heavy coins on the counter. The clatter was sharp and authoritative, a sound of definite purpose that made both Alara and the shopkeeper flinch. Henderson, ever the pragmatist, slid the 40 he had offered back into his till and reached for the ring, assuming the stranger was simply a competing bidder. Alara's heart seized, a fresh wave of agony washing over her as she watched the shopkeeper's tweezers move toward her last memory, ready to deliver it into the hands of this silent, imposing man. But the cowboy's hand, calloused and sun-browned, shot out and gently covered Henderson's, stopping him. He did not grab or shove, his touch was a firm, undeniable statement. Then, with a single finger, he slid the small gold band across the scarred wood, back to her side of the counter, back to where it belonged. Alara's breath hitched in her throat. She stared at the ring, then at the man's face, but his expression was unreadable, hidden in the shadow of his hat brim. He turned his attention back to Henderson, his voice finally breaking the silence, low and steady, a sound like stones settling at the bottom of a river. Flour. A full sack. And beans. Salted pork. Whatever potatoes you have. As he spoke, Henderson, now moving with a stunned, mechanical obedience, began to pile the goods on the counter. The small, insignificant space that had held only a single, heartbreaking ring was now crowded with a mountain of supplies, an impossible bounty that grew with every word the cowboy spoke. When the bag was full, so heavy it seemed it would split, the cowboy paid the rest of what was owed and finally, turned his eyes to Alara. The world seemed to fall away, the store, the shopkeeper, the dust motes in the air, all of it gone, leaving only his quiet, steady gaze. His voice was softer now, meant only for her. Keep it. The words were a command, a release, a benediction. He paused, letting the impossible truth of the moment settle over her. I'll feed you both. Stepping out of the mercantile was like breaking the surface of dark water and taking a first, desperate breath of clean air. The sun, which had been a merciless tyrant on her journey into town, now felt like a warm hand on her cheek, a gentle, forgiving light that seemed to wash the grime of the transaction from her spirit. The cowboy, Jed, moved past her and, with a single, fluid motion that belied its immense weight, he shouldered the heavy sack of supplies. He did not ask if she needed help, he simply took the burden as his own, and in that silent, unassuming act, he lifted a far greater weight from her soul. The walk home was a journey through a landscape transformed. It was the same path, the same cracked earth and stubborn weeds, yet everything was different because she was different. The silence that stretched between them was not the heavy, suffocating silence of her farmhouse, nor the tense, brittle silence of the store. It was a vast, peaceful quiet, a space for her reeling mind to find its footing. There were no words, because words were too small for what had happened. They were inadequate tools to measure the depth of her gratitude or the mystery of his kindness. Instead, the narrative of their journey was written in sensory details. The sound of their boots falling into a steady, shared rhythm on the dirt path was a quiet promise of companionship, a stark contrast to the lonely, desperate drum of her own solitary footsteps just an hour before. The sight of the burlap sack, bulging with the promise of food and medicine, bobbing with the steady cadence of his stride, was a more powerful statement than any sermon on hope she had ever heard. And then there was the ring. Again and again. Her thumb would brush against the smooth, worn gold on her finger. Its warmth was no longer a searing brand of memory and sacrifice, but a gentle, reassuring heat. It was an anchor to her past that was no longer threatened by the storms of the present. She looked at the man beside her, a complete stranger who had appeared out of the shadows like a plains ghost and rewritten her future with a handful of coins and 2 quiet commands. She saw the weathered lines around his eyes, the set of his jaw, the quiet strength in his shoulders, and found no answers, only a profound and humbling sense of wonder. The wind that had clawed at her before now seemed to caress her, a gentle breath that carried the scent of dust and distant rain. The world had not changed, but she had, and that had changed everything. As the small, familiar shape of her farmhouse appeared on the horizon, it no longer looked like a cage of despair, but a sanctuary, a place where, thanks to the quiet shield of the man walking beside her, healing could finally begin. He was gone as quietly as he had appeared, a ghost of kindness who had deposited a miracle on her doorstep and then dissolved back into the vast, indifferent plains, leaving Elara alone with the unbelievable reality of it all. For a long moment, she simply stood in the doorway, the heavy sack a solid presence at her feet, the ring a warm weight on her hand. Then, a weak cough from her mother's room broke the spell, and a new energy, fierce and purposeful, surged through her. She moved not with the heavy languor of despair, but with the crisp, deliberate motions of the woman with a sacred duty to perform. The first act was to banish the shadows. She built a fire in the hearth, the strike of the flint a sharp, defiant spark against the gloom. The kindling caught, and the first hungry flames began to lick at the dry wood, pushing back the oppressive cold and painting the small room in flickering strokes of orange and gold. The oppressive silence was broken by the cheerful crackle and pop of the fire, a sound of life where there had been none. The preparation of the broth was a ritual, a prayer offered in motion. Her hands, which had trembled with fear in the mercantile, were now steady as she unwrapped the precious salted pork, the knife making clean, rhythmic sounds against the cutting board. She chopped the potatoes and onions, their earthy scent rising to mingle with the wood smoke, a fragrance of sustenance that felt like a foreign language in a house that had only known the stale scent of sickness. Every act was imbued with a profound significance, the pouring of water from the jug, the careful stirring of the pot, the watching of the steam as it began to rise, carrying the promise of life-giving warmth. As the broth simmered, filling the farmhouse with its rich, savory aroma, Elara simply watched the firelight dance, her heart a vessel of quiet, overwhelming gratitude. She looked at the simple ingredients, a bounty delivered by a stranger's inexplicable compassion, and saw them not as food, but as grace. She looked at the ring on her finger, safe and home, and a single, silent tear, one not of sorrow but of profound relief, traced a path down her cheek. When the broth was ready, she ladled it into a bowl and carried it to her mother's bedside. The firelight threw their long, dancing shadows against the wall as she sat down, the steam from the bowl rising between them. "Mother." Her voice was soft. Martha's eyes fluttered open, dull and clouded with fever, but they saw the spoon. Elara lifted it to her mother's lips. There was a long, breathless pause. Then, a small, weak parting of the lips, an acceptance. She watched her mother swallow, a tiny, monumental victory. A moment later, the faintest, most fragile of smiles touched Martha's chapped lips, and in that instant, a genuine light, brilliant and fierce, ignited deep in Elara's eyes. Hope had come home, miles away, under a different patch of the same vast, star-dusted sky. Another fire burned. This one was not a cheerful, crackling hearth pushing back the shadows from a sick room, but a small, solitary circle of light in an immense and unfeeling darkness. This was the cowboy's camp. Jed sat with his back against his saddle, watching the flames dance with a stillness that was not peaceful, but heavy with the weight of memory. The firelight carved deep lines into his withered face, illuminating an old, familiar sorrow, a quiet ache in his eyes that was a perfect, haunting mirror of the despair he had witnessed in Elara's that afternoon. He had not simply seen a desperate woman, he had seen a ghost of himself, a reflection from a past he could never outride. This was his ritual for nights like this, nights when the silence of the plains grew too loud, too full of unspoken names. Slowly, his calloused hand went to a small pocket in his worn vest and drew out a silver locket. It was not a grand or ornate thing, it was soft-edged and smooth, its intricate engravings worn down by the constant, unconscious touch of his thumb over countless solitary evenings. It was a heavy object, far heavier than its size would suggest, weighted as it was with the full gravity of a life that was no more. He held it in his palm, the cool metal a stark contrast to the warmth of the fire, letting it rest there like a sleeping bird. But he did not open it. He never did, not anymore. He didn't need to see the faces inside, they were more real to him than the flames in front of his eyes, more present than the ground beneath him. To open it would be to invite the full, crushing force of the memory, a wave he knew he could not survive tonight. His act in the mercantile was not one of simple charity. It was a debt. It was a conversation with ghosts. He had looked at Elar's hand, trembling as it offered up that small gold band, and he had seen the precipice. He recognized the terrible calculus she was performing in her heart, trading a piece of her soul for one more day, because he had stood on that same ledge himself and had found no one there to pull him back. He could not change his own past, could not undo the finality of his own loss, but he could stand in the path of another's. He could, for a day, be the shield he never had. Slowly, he closed his fingers around the locket, slipped it back into its worn pocket, and returned his gaze to the fire, a solitary man paying a debt to a ghost under the silent, watchful eyes of a billion stars. 3 days passed, and the miracle on her counter began to shrink. The flour sack sagged, the salted meat was smaller, and a familiar, cold tendril of anxiety began to curl in Elar's stomach. Hope, she was discovering, was a fragile thing that required constant fuel. She had been living on the warmth of a memory, but memories couldn't be cooked in a pot. On the morning of the 4th day, she stepped onto the porch into the cool, silver light of dawn and found it. A new sack, smaller than the first, but solid and real, sat by the door, filled with potatoes and a fresh joint of cured meat. It was a silent, profound statement, an answer to a prayer she hadn't dared to speak aloud. Her eyes, wide with a dawning, reverent wonder, scanned the vast, empty plains, searching for the source. And then she saw him. He was a long way off, a distant, solitary figure against the endless horizon, not looking toward her house but focused on the dilapidated fence line that marked the edge of her property. He was working, his movements methodical and sure, a rhythmic rise and fall of a post driver that carried faintly on the morning air. He was restoring something that had long been broken. As if sensing her gaze, he paused, his work stilled, and he turned his head. Across the immense distance, their eyes met. He did not wave, he did not smile. He simply gave one slow, deliberate nod, a gesture that was both a question and an answer, a confirmation of the unspoken pact between them. Elar raised a hand not in a wave, but in a simple gesture of acknowledgement, and nodded back. The conversation was over. This became the new rhythm of their lives, a silent partnership played out across 100 yards of dust and prairie grass. His lonely work ran in perfect, unspoken parallel to hers. As he strained to set a heavy cedar post into the stubborn earth, she struggled to lift her mother, helping her sit upright in bed. As he meticulously stretched and tightened strands of rusted wire, making them taut and strong again, she would carefully wring out cool cloths to lay on Martha's brow, fighting the lingering fever. He was mending the physical boundaries of her world, bringing order to the chaos of neglect, while she fought to mend the fragile boundary between her mother's life and the encroaching shadows. Every few mornings, a new offering would appear on her porch. Every day, she would see his steady, reassuring presence in the distance. He was a quiet guardian, a constant figure on the landscape of her life whose character she came to know not through words, but through the unwavering, silent integrity of a promise kept. The days, which had once been individual battles to be survived, now began to soften and blend, melting into weeks of quiet, steady healing. The harsh, unforgiving sun of late summer gave way to the gentler, golden light of autumn, and the change in seasons was mirrored in the small farmhouse. The oppressive silence that had been a shroud over the home was gone, replaced by the soft rustle of a turning page or the gentle clink of a spoon against a bowl. Martha was no longer a fading whisper in a darkened room, she was a presence. One afternoon, Elar looked up from her mending to see her mother sitting in the rocking chair by the hearth, a patchwork quilt spread over her lap, her eyes clear and focused as she watched the flames. A fragile, healthy color had returned to her cheeks, a quiet bloom in a garden that had been fallow for too long. With this slow, steady return of life, the constant, rigid tension in Elar's own shoulders began to ease. The deep, worried lines etched between her brows softened, and the ghost of a smile, a real and genuine thing, began to touch her lips more often. The fear of tomorrow had been vanquished, replaced by the quiet certainty of today, a certainty delivered each morning in the form of a silent offering on her porch and the sight of a lone figure working tirelessly in the distance. The fence was nearly whole now, a long, unbroken line of order and strength where there had once been chaos and decay. One morning, as the rich, comforting aroma of brewing coffee filled the kitchen, a new thought, a new impulse, took hold of Alara. It was a desire not just to receive, but to give back, to close the circle of kindness. She poured a second cup, black and steaming, and carried it outside. With a hand that was now steady, she placed it on the porch railing, a simple, unspoken offering. Then she stepped back inside to watch from the window. She saw him approach later, his long strides eating up the ground. He stopped when he saw the cup, his entire body going still for a long moment. He looked toward the house, and though she couldn't see his expression clearly, she felt his acknowledgement. He picked up the cup, cradling it in his calloused hands, and took a slow drink, his gaze fixed on the horizon, on the fence he had nearly finished. He drank it all, then placed the empty cup carefully back on the railing before turning back to his work. A silent, sincere dialogue had passed between them, clearer than any words. Her offering had said, "I see you. I thank you. You are a good man." His acceptance, and the simple act of returning the empty cup, had replied, "I accept. We are neighbors. The debt is paid." The thaw was complete, leaving in its wake a quiet, unshakable foundation of mutual respect. The dawn arrived not as a sudden event, but as a slow, sacred promise. It began as a faint, pearlescent line on the razor's edge of the horizon, a single thread of light that slowly, patiently, unraveled the deep indigo blanket of the night. Then came the colors, soft at first, then bold, strokes of violet and rose and fiery orange painting the underbellies of the clouds, bleeding across the vast, empty canvas of the sky. When the sun itself finally crested the earth, it was a silent, magnificent explosion of pure, golden light, a wave of warmth and hope that washed over the plains, chasing the last of the long shadows from the hollows and giving the dew-kissed prairie grass the look of 1,000 tiny diamonds. On the porch of the small farmhouse, two figures sat wrapped in heavy wool blankets, watching the daily miracle as if it were the first they had ever seen. Martha, her face still thin but her eyes full of a quiet, steady light, was truly alive, her presence a solid, comforting warmth beside her daughter. Alara's face, tilted toward the growing light, was calm and serene. The lines of grief and worry had not vanished, but they no longer defined her, they were simply part of the map of a journey she had survived. The familiar, rhythmic sound of approaching footsteps drew her gaze. It was Jed, walking not from the fence line, which now stood straight and strong, but from the direction of his own distant camp. His hands were empty. His stride was easy. He was not a provider coming to leave an offering, he was a neighbor, coming to call. He stopped a respectful distance from the porch steps, the new sun catching the weathered lines of his face. He offered no greeting, no words at all, but simply removed his hat in a slow, deliberate gesture of respect to the two women. He gave a single, slow nod, a gesture that acknowledged everything they had all endured and survived. Then, with a simple, eloquent turn of his head, he pointed with his chin toward the collapsed and rotting timbers of the old corral, a ruin that stood as the last monument to the neglect and despair that had once owned this land. The gesture was a question, a silent offer that spoke not of charity, but of partnership. It was an invitation to stop just surviving, and to start rebuilding. Alara looked at the ruin, then back at the men, and a slow, grateful smile spread across her face. She gave a nod of her own, a clear and simple yes. This was not the end of a love story, but the quiet, unadorned beginning of something far more rare, a community. They were three solitary souls, broken in their own ways by the harshness of the frontier, who had found in each other a quiet harbor. They were a testament to the fact that a family is not always born of blood, but sometimes forged in the fires of shared hardship, and cemented by the simple, unspoken promise to face the rising sun. The silence of the plains is now punctuated by a new set of sounds, the rhythmic thud of a maul against a cedar post, the scrape of a shovel in hard-packed earth, the groan of new timbers being set in place. The work on the corral has begun. This is a scene built on a symphony of shared labor. Jed, a figure of quiet competence, provides the raw strength, his movements economical and sure. Alara works alongside him, her motions no longer hesitant or weighed down by sorrow, but fluid and purposeful as she hauls away rotted wood and hands him tools. Most significantly, Martha is not inside. She sits on the porch, wrapped in her quilt, her hands, now steady, mending a burlapped sack. She is a quiet, watchful anchor, her presence a testament to their collective victory. The narrative focuses on a small, wordless exchange. Jed needs a hammer, and without looking up, he simply extends his hand. Alara places it in his palm, and for a brief moment, their work-roughened hands brush, a simple, unromantic touch of profound partnership. As the afternoon sun casts long, warm shadows, they pause, looking at the first section of the new, sturdy fence. No words are spoken, but a shared look of quiet, bone-deep satisfaction passes between the three of them. The day ends not with the fear of encroaching darkness, but with the peaceful fatigue that follows a day of meaningful work, solidifying the foundation of their unspoken family. Help us tell more stories from the quiet frontier. Please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell. You'll be the first to know when the next chapter arrives.